Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His mercy endures forever. Welcome to Faith Matters with Phillip Campbell, a Catholic variety program broadcasting on Good Shepherd Catholic Radio out here in lovely Jackson, Michigan. I am Phillip Campbell, your host and traveling companion for the next half hour. And as always, I'm so pleased that you are tuning in to be with us again for another episode of Faith Matters. I have a guest with me, Mr. Joe Lipa. Joe is going to be talking about something that has just grown in popularity over past, what has it been, 13 years now, since Pope Benedict's Summorum Pontificum, that granted any priest the freedom to say the traditional Latin Mass without having to get any approval from a bishop or anybody else. Since Pope Benedict XVI allowed that back in 2007, the traditional Latin Mass has spread all over the place. There used to be only a couple in southeast Michigan. Now I think there's something like 14 or 15 in the greater Detroit area alone. It's a type of liturgy that a lot of Catholics are finding great refreshment and renewal. So Joe, my guest, he's been attending the traditional Latin Mass for over 10 years. He first attended when he's 18 years old, and he's been active in the Latin Mass community in Ann Arbor, helping organize liturgies as a master of ceremonies. He trains altar servers, and he promotes evangelization among young adults. And Joe, literally, he's gone out on the street, hands out things to people, talks about Jesus. He's a wonderful young man that I'm very honored to know. Joe Lipa, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Philip. It's great to be here.
So I mainly wanted to have a conversation with you about the traditional Latin Mass, how you came to attend it, what you find edifying about it, and why you believe so many other young Catholics feel the same way, because I went to a Latin Mass last weekend at the St. Joseph Shrine in Detroit. You go to a Latin Mass and you're really blown away by how many young people there are there. Young people, young families, children everywhere. That's something I want to get into. But before we get into that, I assume you didn't grow up attending the Latin Mass. How did you discover the traditional Latin Mass?
Yeah, so I'm 28 years old. So I was born in 1992, and of course that's decades after Vatican II in the early 60s and the liturgical reforms that came out after that. And so I grew up attending Mass in English, what we call the ordinary form, or the Novus Ordo Mass. And my parish occasionally used Latin growing up, maybe during Lent, with the Sanctus or the Agnus Dei.
Sure.
But I guess I should stress that the Latin Mass is not just the language of the Mass. So you can do the Novus Ordo, the new Mass that came out of Vatican II, in Latin. But what I'm talking about here when I refer to the Latin Mass is the preconciliar Mass. It's called the Missal of 1962, or Pope Benedict called it the extraordinary form of the Mass.
Right.
I think growing up, I had a vague understanding that way back in the day, the Mass was celebrated in Latin and the priest has back to the people. And, looking back, it's really amazing to see how God's providence kind of leads you maybe one step at a time. Sometimes I'm attending a Latin Mass and you can think, wow, how did I end up here? It's funny, for me, I think it really started with actually a love of Spanish. In high school, I was kind of obsessed with Spanish. I would annoy people by constantly talking in Spanish. I one time tried to go an entire day without saying a word in English. Thankfully, as part of that, one of the things I learned are the prayers in Spanish. So the main prayers, the Our Father, the Hail Mary, the Glory Be, and my goal was eventually to be able to say an all-Spanish rosary. But it also occurred to me about the same time that Latin was the universal language of the Church. And so I figured, well, I better also try to learn those prayers in Latin. So the Pater Noster, the Ave Maria, the Gloria Patri. And I did, and about the same time, I had read about the Latin Mass on EWTN. And it sounded interesting to me, kind of foreign, but intriguing. So I found a list of directories of all the Latin Masses in the area. And as you mentioned, back then it was much fewer than now. Actually, the one I came across was St. Joseph the Worker in Jackson, Michigan.
Oh, I know that place. We're sitting there right now.
Right, yeah. I know you're broadcasting out of Jackson. So.
Where St. Joseph the Worker, we're right in the parish complex here, so that's where the station is broadcast out of.
Oh, you're kidding.
No.
Yeah, so it hits, I'm sure, very close to home.
Yeah.
And so I walked in, and Phillip, little did I know how much that next hour would change my life. I still remember the day. It was June 13th, 2010. I had begged my dad to take me. Again, I didn't quite realize the implications of what I was about to experience.
So it started with just a love of Latin, and you know what's interesting? I remember when I first entered the church, like you said, you had a vague knowledge that the church used to speak Latin. I didn't even have that vague knowledge. I came into the church from Protestantism. I thought Catholics still spoke Latin all the time. I thought to be Catholic, you had to actually know Latin. So right around the time I was converting, I was like, I better learn Latin. And I enrolled in college level Latin courses and started studying Latin. And then I started going to Mass, and after a while, I was like, where's the Latin? Where's the Latin? And then I realized, oh no, we don't do that anymore. It was just kind of a funny story. So you're going to the traditional Latin Mass, you walk into St. Joseph the Worker, and what was your reaction when you experienced it the first time? And I guess, how did your perception change over time?
Yeah, well, I guess at first it was a real culture shock. I remember I kept waiting for the priest to do the sign of the cross. Actually, this, of course, is the part that's done silently at the beginning, what's called the prayers at the foot of the altar. So I was quite confused, got through it. Obviously, there are some similarities to what I was used to, but afterwards, I really didn't know quite what to think, because I'd been Catholic, obviously, my whole life, and this is just so different than what I was used to. And I imagine I'm not alone in that. I think it really is a culture shock when people attend the first time, especially if you didn't grow up with it. But I kept attending, and I always encourage people to at least give it 3 tries before you kind of decide whether you like it or not. And I remember the second time I came with my whole family, and it was actually a low Mass, which is probably even more of a culture shock. This is kind of like the equivalent of a weekday Mass, so you have not all the music and fewer smells and bells.
It's pretty quiet, because almost all the prayers are said silently. And I remember my first low Mass, I was sitting there at Old St. Patrick in Ann Arbor watching the priest, and I kept waiting for the Mass to start, and then it ended, and I didn't realize that was the Mass, because there was nothing was said out loud, there wasn't responses, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess that was it.
Yeah, well, I give my family credit for sticking through it, because, imagine that's your first experience. For me, it was my second, and my third experience was on the total opposite side of the spectrum. It was actually a pontifical high Mass celebrated by Bishop Joseph Perry, and it was in this beautiful church in Detroit called St. Josephat, and, full choir and all the bells and smells. And I think in those 3 tries, 3 times attending, I really got the full range of the experiences. And, I think, and then I kept going to it. Something kept drawing me to go, and the more and more I went, the more I began to recognize its richness and to understand the reasons for some of these differences, some of the things that I thought were strange at first. For example, like the priest facing, you might say with his back to the people. I think a better phrase is he's facing with the people.
Yeah.
So, you're not necessarily offended if the person in front of you, in the pew in front of you, has their back to you. I mean, that's kind of expected because you're all facing in the same direction. And in the same way, I think it makes sense, the posture in the Latin Mass of having the priest also face with the people and is in fact leading the people. There's a Latin phrase that's called ad orientem, which refers to that posture of everyone facing, literally it's called to the east, ad orientem, which has beautiful symbolism because it represents Christ who comes from the east. Christ was traditionally represented by the rising sun, which of course comes from the east. So things like that really started to click with me. And also even the Latin, realizing that we're part of a universal church. The word Catholic means universal. And so it makes sense that we would have a universal language that we can all worship in together. And even the silence, like, it was such a great antidote to the noise of the world where, there's so much, we're constantly being stimulated by all this noise and action, and to just be able to sit in silence and pray with the priest, that's, very powerful experience. And I think I began to become more comfortable with it during time.
Yeah, I remember even at my first high mass, it was difficult to get used to the silence, But I agree. That's one of the things I love most about it now is the periods of silence where the liturgy doesn't demand that I do anything or say anything. It allows me to just pray in silence with the priest and with the whole church. And that's so valuable in this day and age when there's so many distractions,
Yeah, that's a great point. And, to be honest, it's still something I struggle with the silence, because like you said, Philip, you always, at least I do, I always kind of want to be doing something. And, well, when's it my turn to do my part? But the Latin Mass kind of just brings you back to that prayerful atmosphere of, it's not so much what you do, it's what God does in the liturgy.
Right. We all want to be Marthas, and Jesus tells us to be a Mary, right?
Yeah, that's right.
What do you find edifying about attending the Latin Mass? And I guess maybe you already hit on this, but what do you find challenging about it? How has it helped you to grow spiritually?
Sure. Yeah, one of the things that really strikes me about the Latin Mass is its authenticity. It goes all the way back to the early church. So we're talking centuries and centuries of passing on what the earlier generations received. So, one of the things about the Latin Mass is it's kind of archaic. It's almost like stepping back into time. I think a better way to put it is it's like stepping beyond time, because, the liturgy is supposed to be the eternal banquet, and there's no time in heaven. So really just that authenticity, and along with it, the reverence. I think one of the things I find very moving about the Latin Mass is how every rubric, every gesture, you can tell that there's just reverence built into it. And one of the things I find especially beautiful is the reception of Holy Communion, that there's only one way to receive Holy Communion in the Latin Mass, which is kneeling and on the tongue. And whether you're the Pope or the most lowly lay person, you're going to receive communion that way. I think it's really, really a beautiful gesture.
And
then,
beautiful.
Of course, there's the order and the dignity. And one of the things that always strikes me and might strike people who attend the Latin Mass for the first time is that it attracts a lot of men, actually. And I think that's due to this very orderly, almost military-like precision with which the Mass is celebrated. And also the servers, I think, take great pride. As someone you mentioned, I helped train servers, and it's really moving to see the pride they take in serving the Mass so perfectly. We want to get it just right. And then there's also the music. And I've come to appreciate over time how, chant is really sung prayers. So they're not just chanting a random tune. These are actually the prayers of the Mass that are set to these beautiful melodies. And then I think probably the biggest thing for me is also the timelessness and the connection with the past. So this is the Mass that St. Gregory of the Great celebrated, St. Thomas Aquinas. This is the Mass that St. Francis Xavier and the Jesuit missionaries took to all corners of the world. Father Damien taking it to the leper colony in Hawaii. Or this is the Mass St. Therese of Lisieux experienced in the convent, or St. Faustina. If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me, is something I've realized over time. I may not understand every little thing, there may be challenges like the silence, like the Latin, but there's got to be something to it if it has a long track record of forming all these saints.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great point. This was the Mass that in my in my previous segment I was mentioning St. Francis of Assisi and all the good that he did in the church, and this was the Mass that he would have celebrated, that Padre Pio celebrated, Gregory the Great, Teresa of Avila, or even that John Paul II grew up with. This was the Mass he celebrated for, I think, the first 25 years of his priesthood. So it has formed so many saints, and really plugs us in to the heritage of the Church. Now, given that, I mean, why do you think so many young Catholics are attracted to the Mass? Because I do think, I don't know, I don't think it's just anecdotal. Like, I've been to many Latin Masses, and it's always thriving with young families. I think that's empirically verifiable to anyone who's ever been to one. Why do you think young Catholics are attracted to it?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I've noticed the same thing. You know, it's not just me as a young Catholic. There's so many other young Catholics that you'll find at a Latin Mass. You know, I think it has to do with the fact that God put into our hearts a desire for the good, the true, and the beautiful. Mm-hmm. And, you know, this applies to everyone, but I think especially young people, given the culture that we've grown up today, which is so secular. You know, there's such a lack of true goodness and beauty, and there's such a focus on the here and now, you know, the earthly and temporal over the supernatural and eternal. And everything's always changing. You know, there's so much noise. And so as young people, this is the culture we've grown up in, and we've never really known anything else. And I think when churches recognize this, there's kind of two approaches that could be taken. The first is kind of to become just like the world, in an attempt to be, you might call, relevant. So I think the problem with that is, well, then what's the point of church? Like, you know, if I can get the same thing by just turning on the radio, why do I need to wake up early and go to Mass?
Right.
I think the other approach, which we really see in the Latin Mass, is not so much the attempt to bring God down to man, but it's to bring man up to God and to become, you might say, otherworldly, or to transcend this world so that we can seek the eternal and the heavenly. I think this is really exactly what the Latin Mass does. It really fosters that sense of the sacred that young people today are absolutely craving. We want something solid and not something that changes with the times. We want it to change the times.
Yeah, not something that's just like trying to be hip based on somebody's ideal of what the kids these days are into, right?
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, it's funny you mentioned that because there's a prominent Jesuit recently that called for young people to be banned from attending the Latin Mass.
I remember reading
when
that.
I saw that, yeah, I just had to laugh because, you know, I think it shows maybe the disconnect between what young people want and what people of other generations think young people want. And, you know, in many ways, I think the Latin Mass is the antithesis of our modern secular culture. And so it's really almost like a refuge that we can go to when we're so bombarded with the culture. We can go to for like an oasis of spiritual relief.
Now, for many older Catholics, maybe people my age, middle age, the traditional Latin Mass in decades ago was associated with the Society of St. Pius X, which was in an irregular canonical status or schism. I'm not competent on the canonical aspects of it, but one of the great things about today is that that Benedict XVI has made it available to any Catholic who wants to attend, any priest who wants to say the Mass. And so I think it's important for maybe Catholics who grew up thinking of the traditional Latin Mass as like, oh, that's just something the SSPX does, That's not the case anymore. This is mainstream. This is happening. I mean, at my parish in Old St. Patrick in Ann Arbor, it's said regularly. Here in Jackson, for those of you listening in Jackson, it's said every week at Star of the Sea at 1 p.m. Sometimes the pastor, Father Tim Nelson, says it. So this isn't like a weird fringe thing within the church. This is very much within the mainstream, and not just in the mainstream, but something envisioned by Pope Benedict XVI that he hoped would enrich the life of Catholics, even those who regularly go to the ordinary form. Is that accurate, Joe?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Philip. You go to a Latin Mass and you find normal Catholics living normal lives with all the challenges and struggles of our modern culture, and so it's a great kind of spiritual strength to be able to kind of use that to recharge your battery pack. And one of the things I'll mention too is just, maybe there's a temptation. Some people experience the Latin Mass the first time and they realize so much of their Catholic heritage wasn't known to them, that they wonder, why didn't I ever know this? And maybe there's a temptation to be bitter, like, why was this taken from me? But I think a much better reaction is one of joy and gratitude at rediscovering our Catholic heritage. It's kind of like discovering a treasure where you had no idea it existed. I didn't know about the Latin Mass for 18 years of my life, and having discovered it, it's a treasure that you can continuously unpack, for a lifetime. And just to be able to discover that, I think, is such a great blessing, and should really lead to joy and gratitude.
It is a blessing. And so let's say someone takes me up on this, listens to this, says, I'd like to go to that. I've mentioned it's offered in Detroit all the time at the Institute Shrine, St. Joseph. It's offered every Sunday in Jackson at Star of the Sea, 1 p.m. What is it, Old St. Patrick? Is it the first Sunday of the month?
It's the second Sunday of the month at 12:30 p.m. And then we just started also in Ann Arbor at St. Thomas, right, every Sunday at 11 a.m.
Yeah, so you've got you've got it every Sunday at 11 in Ann Arbor, and then every second Sunday of the month in Ann Arbor also. So there's multiple options. But let's say someone wants to go. What tips do you have for folks who are maybe new to this or just going to check it out? What would you say to somebody who's just getting into going to the traditional Latin Mass?
Sure. Well, as I said before, I recommend giving it at least 3 tries before you make up your mind about it. Another thing is to just, the first times you go, don't worry so much about following along.
Yeah.
Put down your missal and just sit back and take it in. Listen to the music. Just try to unite yourself to the prayer of the Mass, because that's really what the Mass is. It's the representation of the sacrifice of Christ on Calvary. So we don't necessarily have to be doing something. We just have to be there and unite ourselves with the Mass. And there's really no one right way to pray the Mass, which is really nice. Some people do follow every word in the Missal. Others more kind of sit back and pray however their heart moves them. So that's really nice. And then another thing is, so I encourage young men to learn to serve the Latin Mass. It's a great way to grow in your devotion to the faith and to God. If you like to sing, form a scola. Even if you don't have a Latin Mass right by you, you can at least lay the groundwork and start putting the pieces in place. And then finally, to priests, I'd really just encourage priests to give it a try. I know someone who's trained over 150 priests to celebrate the Latin Mass, and he remarked that it's a very common experience for priests to just begin weeping during the consecration, during their first Latin Mass, because it really helps them understand so much their priesthood, and who they are as another Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great advice, Joe. Great advice. Is there Is there any other comments you'd want to make? We have to wrap this up here in about 2 minutes. So do you have any closing comments or observations you want to make?
Sure. Yeah, I'd just like to point out the connection between the Latin Mass and evangelization. You know, the Mass is the source and summit of our faith, but there's an entire culture that flows from the Latin Mass. So processions, sacred music, sacred art and architecture. You have these beautiful traditional devotions and feast day celebrations. And so as I said, I think we can really have a great joy in being able to rediscover this, especially those of my generation who maybe didn't grow up with it. And it's also encouraging that, you know, where the Latin Mass is thriving, you also see a thriving Catholic culture. And this is ultimately the culture that built our Christian civilization. And we've done it once. And it's so encouraging over the past 10, 15 years, the growth. It really makes me think, you know, we can do it again with the grace of God, of course, or at least die trying.
And we are doing it again. We're doing it in little places like at St. Thomas in Ann Arbor and Star of the Sea here and all over where the little pockets where the traditional Latin Mass is being offered. Joe, Lipa, thank you very much for your time. That was a very great interview, sir. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me again, Philip, and God bless you.
God bless you. So until next time, my friends, this has been Faith Matters with Philip Campbell. May the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. God bless.